I never imagined my life would unravel the way it did. My wife, Lisa, and I had been married for nearly 25 years. We had what most would consider a solid marriage, complete with the typical ups and downs, but nothing that ever made me question our bond. We raised 2 kids together, both of whom are now grown and living on their own. I'd always been the provider, working hard to ensure we lived comfortably, while Lisa managed the home and kids. We had a routine that worked, or so I thought. Our story began to shift about a year ago, but I was too blind to see it. Lisa had started to change in ways that were subtle at first, easy to overlook or dismiss. She was more distant, less interested in spending time together, and increasingly preoccupied with her phone. I noticed she was more critical of me, snapping over small things that never used to bother her. I chalked it up to midlife stress, maybe the empty nest syndrome kicking in now that the kids were out of the house. I'd always trusted Lisa implicitly. We'd been through so much together, financial struggles, raising kids, the loss of her father, and had come out stronger on the other side. That's why when she started taking more girls' nights out and spending time at the gym, I didn't think much of it. She told me she needed time for herself, to feel more confident and attractive again. I supported her in that, never once suspecting there could be anything more to it. Our sex life, which had once been the cornerstone of our connection, became sporadic and mechanical. She claimed she was too tired, too stressed, or just not in the mood. It stung, but I convinced myself that it was just another phase in a long marriage. I tried to be patient, to give her space, hoping things would eventually return to normal. But they didn't. Instead, the distance between us only grew. I started noticing little things that didn't add up. She began locking her phone, something she'd never done before. There were nights when she'd go out and wouldn't return until late, with vague excuses about getting caught up with friends. Her wardrobe changed, too suddenly. She was buying new clothes, more revealing than what she'd usually wear. When I asked her about it, she brushed me off, saying she just wanted to feel good about herself. Then there was the time I found a hotel keycard in her purse. My heart sank, but she quickly explained it away, saying it belonged to a friend who had stayed at a hotel recently and accidentally left it in her car. She claimed she was holding on to it until she could return it. I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. So, I did. But deep down, something was gnawing at me, a growing suspicion that I couldn't shake. I started checking her phone whenever I could, but she had become too careful. She deleted messages, cleared her call history, and kept her phone on her at all times. I felt like I was losing my mind, consumed by doubt, yet too afraid to confront her directly. What if I was wrong? What if I was just being paranoid? It wasn't until one night, after another one of her late returns, that I finally broke. She walked in around midnight, looking disheveled, her lipstick smudged, and her hair a mess. I asked her where she'd been, trying to keep my voice steady, but she just laughed it off, saying I was being ridiculous. That was the moment I knew. The moment I could no longer deny the truth that had been staring me in the face for months. My wife was cheating on me. I still remember the day like it was yesterday. It was a Friday, and I had left work early. It had been a tough week, and I figured getting home early would be a nice surprise for Lisa. The kids were spending the weekend at their grandparents' house, giving us some rare time alone. I had imagined us sitting on the couch, maybe watching a movie together, rekindling some of the closeness we'd lost. But when I pulled into the driveway, something felt off. The house was too quiet, too still. Normally, if Lisa was home, I'd hear the TV or music playing, or at least the sounds of her moving around. But that day, nothing. The only sign of life was her car parked in the driveway. As I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, the quietness was almost eerie. I called out for her, but there was no response. The silence was heavy, pressing down on me as I made my way through the house. I reached the kitchen and noticed her phone on the counter, a rare sight given how attached she usually was to it. My gut tightened, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. Something was wrong, very wrong. I moved down the hallway towards our bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and as I got closer, I heard faint noises, muffled sounds that sent a chill down my spine. My heart started pounding in my chest as I slowly pushed the door open, praying I was wrong, that I'd find her watching TV or napping. But the scene that greeted me was nothing I could have prepared for. There, in our bed, was Lisa. Naked. And she wasn't alone. The rage that exploded inside me was instant and uncontrollable. I saw red as I took in the sight of her with another man, their bodies intertwined in the sheets we had shared for years. It was the most primal, gut-wrenching betrayal I had ever felt. I could barely think, could barely breathe. All I could feel was the overwhelming urge to destroy the man who had dared to touch my wife. Without a word, I launched myself at him. He was just as startled as Lisa, but unlike her, he had no time to react. My fist connected with his face before he even had the chance to untangle himself from her. The impact was hard, satisfying in a way that words can't describe. The pain in my knuckles as they cracked against his jaw felt like a release, a way to channel the agony that had been building inside me for months. He tried to fight back, but he was no match for the fury driving me. I wasn't thinking, just swinging, hitting him again and again, each punch fueled by the betrayal I felt. The sound of my fists hitting his flesh echoed in the room, mixed with the sound of Lisa screaming, begging me to stop. But I couldn't stop. Not yet. I landed another blow, this time to his ribs, and he gasped in pain, doubling over. He tried to grab my arm, to push me away, but I wasn't going to let him get off that easy. I shoved him back, sending him sprawling across the bed, and climbed on top of him, pinning him down. His eyes were wide with fear, blood streaming from his nose and mouth, but I didn't care. He was nothing more than a target to me, someone to blame for the destruction of my marriage. "What the fuck are you doing in my house?" I shouted, my voice barely recognizable through the rage. He didn't answer, just stared up at me, his eyes pleading for mercy. But I had none to give. I raised my fist again, ready to deliver another blow, but Lisa grabbed my arm, pulling me back with all her strength. "Stop. Please, stop," she screamed, her voice hoarse from crying. I shook her off, but the brief distraction gave him the chance to scramble away, falling to the floor with a thud. He tried to stand, but I was on him again in an instant, dragging him up by his hair and slamming him against the wall. "How long has this been going on?" I demanded, my face inches from his. He didn't answer, just whimpered like a beaten dog. I slammed him against the wall again, harder this time, making the picture frames rattle. "Answer me!" I yelled, but he just groaned, too stunned and terrified to speak. Lisa was sobbing now, her hands covering her face as she crouched on the bed. She looked so pathetic, so small and broken, but I couldn't bring myself to feel any sympathy for her. All I could think about was how she had betrayed me in the worst way possible, bringing this scumbag into our home, our bed, while our children were away. Finally, the bastard managed to choke out a few words between his gasps for breath. It was just sex. I swear, it didn't mean anything. His words were like gasoline on the fire of my anger. Just sex? Just sex? He had the nerve to stand there, bleeding in my house, and reduce my wife, my marriage, to something as meaningless as just sex? I lost it. Completely. I punched him again, hard enough to make his head snap back against the wall. I felt something crack beneath my knuckles, and I didn't care if it was his skull or my bones. He crumpled to the floor, barely conscious, and I stood over him, my chest heaving, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I wanted to finish him off, to make sure he'd never forget the day he decided to fuck with the wrong man. But as I stood there, fists clenched and ready to deliver the final blow, I caught sight of Lisa through the corner of my eye. She was a mess, her face red and blotchy, tears streaming down her cheeks, her body shaking with sobs. For a moment, the rage inside me faltered, replaced by something even worse, an overwhelming, crushing sense of loss. The woman I loved, the woman I had built a life with, was gone. And in her place was this stranger, this hysterical mess who had torn my world apart. I turned back to the man on the floor, his face unrecognizable now beneath the blood and bruises. He was nothing to me, just a pathetic piece of shit who had gotten caught up in something bigger than he could handle. Killing him wouldn't bring back what I had lost. It wouldn't make me feel any better. If anything, it would make everything worse. I let out a shuddering breath and stepped back, releasing him from my grip. He slumped to the floor, wheezing, and didn't try to get up. I looked down at him one last time, the anger slowly draining out of me, replaced by a hollow emptiness. "Get the fuck out of my house," I said, my voice low and cold. He didn't need to be told twice. He crawled towards the door, his movements slow and painful, leaving a trail of blood on the carpet. I watched him go, feeling nothing but disgust. Once he was gone, I turned to Lisa, who was still crying on the bed. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, and I saw the guilt and shame written all over her face. But I wasn't ready to deal with her yet. Not while my fists were still throbbing and my heart was still aching. Without a word, I left the room, slamming the door behind me. I needed to get out of there, to put as much distance between myself and the wreckage of my life as possible. I didn't know where I was going or what I was going to do next. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. I didn't leave the house that night. I couldn't. As much as I wanted to walk away, to put everything behind me, I felt like my feet were glued to the floor. I ended up sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the wall, trying to process what had just happened. The adrenaline from the fight had drained away, leaving me feeling numb and exhausted. I could hear Lisa moving around upstairs, crying softly to herself, but I didn't go to her. I didn't want to see her face, to deal with the mess she had made of our lives. I was too raw, too angry to even think about what I should do next. A few hours passed, though it felt like an eternity. I just sat there, replaying everything over and over in my mind, her betrayal, the fight, the moment I realized that my marriage was nothing more than a lie. Eventually, the house fell silent again, and I assumed Lisa had finally cried herself to sleep. But I wasn't going to let her off that easily. I stood up, my muscles stiff and aching from the beating I had delivered, and made my way upstairs. The door to our bedroom was still closed, and for a moment, I hesitated. I could have walked away, gone to sleep in one of the other rooms and dealt with everything in the morning. But I knew there was no way I was going to get any sleep until I got some answers. Pushing the door open, I stepped inside. Lisa was sitting on the edge of the bed, her face buried in her hands. She didn't look up when I entered, but I could see the way her shoulders shook with every sob. For a moment, I just stood there, watching her, trying to summon the strength to say something. Anything. But all I could feel was that same emptiness, that gaping hole where my heart used to be. The love I'd had for her, the love that had once defined my entire existence, was gone, snuffed out like a candle in the wind. What was left was a deep, bone-chilling sense of betrayal that threatened to swallow me whole. Why? I finally asked, my voice coming out rough and hoarse. It was a simple question, but the weight of it hung heavy in the air. Why did she do it? Why did she betray me in the worst possible way? Why did she destroy everything we had built together? Lisa looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She just stared at me, her face crumpling as fresh tears welled up in her eyes. I waited, giving her a chance to explain herself, to give me some sort of reason that could help me understand. But all she did was shake her head, as if the answers were too painful to say out loud. Why, Lisa? I repeated, my voice rising with frustration. I deserve an answer. I don't know, she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know why, it just happened. Bullshit, I snapped, the anger flaring up inside me once more. You don't just accidentally fuck another man in your husband's bed. You knew exactly what you were doing. She flinched at my words, her hands clenching into fists on her lap. I didn't mean for it to happen, she insisted, her voice trembling. It started out as nothing, just flirting, just something to make me feel better about myself. But then it got out of hand. Out of hand? I echoed, my voice dripping with sarcasm. That's how you're going to explain this? It got out of hand? Jesus, Lisa, we're not talking about spilling a fucking glass of milk here. You betrayed me. You betrayed our marriage. You brought that piece of shit into our house, into our bed, and you expect me to believe it was just some kind of mistake? I was lonely, she suddenly shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. You were always working, always gone. The kids moved out, and I was alone all the time. I needed someone, something. I needed to feel like I mattered to someone again. And I didn't matter to you anymore? I shot back, my fists clenching at my sides. Was I not enough? Was our life together not enough for you? Her eyes filled with fresh tears, and she shook her head again, her lips trembling as she tried to form words. It wasn't like that, she choked out. You've always been enough, but I wasn't. I wasn't enough for you, for myself. I felt invisible, like I was just fading away. I stared at her, my chest heaving with the effort to keep my emotions in check. Part of me wanted to understand, to sympathize with her pain, her loneliness. But a much larger part of me wanted to scream at her, to tell her that she had no right to feel that way, not after what she'd done. And fucking another man was your solution? I asked, my voice cold and bitter. That was how you decided to deal with it? By screwing some asshole in the bed we shared for over 2 decades? I made a mistake, she whispered, her eyes pleading with me to understand. I know I did, and I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. Well, you did, I said flatly, refusing to let her off the hook. You hurt me more than I ever thought possible. You destroyed everything, Lisa. Everything. The room fell silent again, the weight of my words hanging in the air like a leaden cloud. Lisa wiped at her tears, her hands shaking as she struggled to compose herself. But there was no fixing this. No words she could say, no apology she could offer that would ever undo the damage she had done. What do you want me to do? She asked after a long moment, her voice barely above a whisper. How can I make this right? I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head in disbelief. You can't, I said bluntly. There's no fixing this. You can't just say you're sorry and expect everything to go back to the way it was. It doesn't work that way. She looked down at her hands, her face crumpling with the weight of her guilt. I could see the realization dawning on her, the understanding that there was no easy way out of this mess she had created. I still love you, she said quietly, her voice trembling with emotion. I never stopped loving you. Then why did you do it? I demanded, my voice rough with pain. If you loved me, if you really fucking loved me, why did you do this to us? I don't know, she whispered, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I was stupid. I was selfish. I thought I could keep it separate, that it wouldn't affect what we had. But I was wrong. Yeah, I said bitterly. You were. We fell into another silence, the tension in the room so thick it was suffocating. I wanted to keep yelling at her, to keep throwing her betrayal back in her face, but I was too tired, too drained. All the fight had gone out of me, leaving nothing but a hollow, aching emptiness in its place. So what now? Lisa finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. Are you going to leave me? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. I knew what she was asking, if I was going to file for divorce, if I was going to walk away from our marriage for good. But I couldn't bring myself to answer her, not yet. The thought of ending it all, of cutting her out of my life completely, was almost as painful as the betrayal itself. I don't know, I finally said, my voice low and rough. I don't know what I'm going to do. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and filled with fear. Please, don't leave me, she begged, her voice cracking. I know I don't deserve it, but please, don't leave me. We can fix this. We can go to counseling, we can talk it out, we can do whatever it takes, just don't leave me. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I could see the desperation in her eyes, the raw fear of losing everything she had taken for granted. But I couldn't just forgive her, couldn't just pretend that everything was okay. What she had done was unforgivable, a betrayal so deep that it had shattered the very foundation of our marriage. But the truth was, I wasn't ready to make any decisions. Not yet. The pain was too fresh, the wound too raw. I needed time to think, to figure out what the hell I was going to do with my life now that everything I had known was falling apart. I need some space, I finally said, my voice cold and detached. I can't deal with this right now. She nodded, her face crumpling with a fresh wave of tears. Okay, she whispered, her voice trembling. I understand. Take all the time you need. I'll be here. I'll be waiting. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her sitting there in the wreckage of our lives. I didn't know what the future held, or if there was even a future for us. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed were a blur. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything but the betrayal that had torn my life apart. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them together in our bed, and it felt like a knife twisting in my gut. The anger that had fueled me during the confrontation had simmered down, but it hadn't disappeared. It had settled into something colder, more calculated, a desire for revenge. Lisa kept her distance, which was a wise choice on her part. She knew I needed time, but I could see the fear in her eyes every time we crossed paths in the house. It was clear she was terrified of what I might do, and that fear only fueled my resentment. She spent most of her time locked away in the bedroom, while I stayed downstairs, trying to figure out my next move. I couldn't just let her off the hook. There was no way I was going to let her walk away from this unscathed. The pain she had caused me deserved payback, and I was going to make sure she felt every ounce of it. But I knew I had to be smart about it. This wasn't just about getting even, it was about making her regret every single decision that led her to betray me. I needed to hit her where it hurt the most, and I knew exactly how to do it. First, I needed to gain control. Lisa had always been the one who managed our finances, paid the bills, and kept track of our accounts. It was something I'd never bothered with, trusting her completely to handle it all. But now, I realized how vulnerable that had made me. I needed to take back that power, to make sure she couldn't manipulate the situation to her advantage. I spent hours going through our financial records, combing through bank statements, credit card bills, and investments. It was a tedious process, but it paid off. I found several large withdrawals that she had made over the past few months, all under the guise of household expenses. But the amounts were far too large for what she had claimed they were for. It didn't take long to piece together that she had been using our money to fund her affair, fancy dinners, hotel rooms, gifts for that bastard she'd been screwing. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks, and the rage I thought I had under control came roaring back. Not only had she betrayed me emotionally, but she had also been siphoning off our hard-earned money to support her infidelity. It was a level of deceit that I hadn't even considered, and it pushed me over the edge. I knew what I had to do. The first step was to cut her off completely, to make sure she couldn't access a single cent of our money without my permission. I went to the bank the next morning, withdrew half of everything we had, and opened a new account in my name only. I changed the passwords on all our joint accounts and set up alerts for any transactions she might try to make. When I got home, I logged into our online banking and transferred the remaining funds into my new account, leaving just enough in the joint account to cover the next round of bills. She wouldn't be able to make any big purchases without my knowledge, and she'd have to come to me if she needed money for anything else. By the time she realized what I had done, it was too late. I heard her upstairs, frantically trying to log into our accounts, only to find she'd been locked out. The sound of her frustration, her desperation, was music to my ears. "What the hell, John?" she finally stormed downstairs, her face pale with anger and fear. "Why can't I access our accounts?" "Because they're my accounts now," I said calmly, barely looking up from the newspaper I was pretending to read. "You don't get to use our money to fund your little adventures anymore." She stared at me, her eyes wide with shock. "You can't do this," she stammered. "We're married. That money belongs to both of us." "Not anymore, it doesn't," I replied, setting the paper aside and fixing her with a cold stare. "You made sure of that when you decided to cheat on me. You want to fuck around behind my back? Fine. But you're not going to do it on my dime." Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. I could see the panic setting in as she realized the full extent of what I had done. She had been relying on that money, probably planning to use it as a safety net if things went south with me. But now, she had nothing. She was completely at my mercy. "I'll still pay the bills," I continued, my voice icy. "But that's it. If you need anything else, you'll have to ask me for it. And I'll decide if it's something you deserve." "You can't be serious," she finally managed to choke out, her voice trembling. This is insane." "No, what's insane is thinking you could betray me and get away with it," I snapped, standing up and towering over her. "What did you think, Lisa? That I'd just forgive you? That we'd go to therapy and work things out? You destroyed our marriage. You destroyed everything we built together. And now you're going to pay for it." She shrank back, her eyes filling with tears. But I wasn't moved. The sight of her crying did nothing for me anymore. I was done being manipulated by her emotions, done feeling sorry for her. "John, please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I know I messed up, but we can work through this. I still love you." "Don't," I said sharply, cutting her off. "Don't you dare say that to me. You don't get to use that word anymore. You threw away any right to talk about love when you let that piece of shit into our bed." Her tears spilled over, and she collapsed onto the couch, sobbing into her hands. I watched her for a moment, feeling nothing but a cold satisfaction. She was finally feeling a fraction of the pain she had caused me, and it was exactly what she deserved. "I'll be filing for divorce," I said, my voice steady. "But until then, you're going to live by my rules. If you don't like it, you can leave. But if you stay, you'll follow every single one of them." She looked up at me, her face wet with tears, and nodded weakly. I could see the defeat in her eyes, the realization that she had no power left in this relationship. It was all mine now, and I was going to make sure she knew it. "The first rule," I said, "is that you're not going to see him again. Ever. If I find out you've even spoken to him, I'll make sure you regret it." "I won't," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I promise." "The second rule," I continued, "is that you're going to start earning your keep. You've lived off me for too long, and that's going to change. You're going to find a job and start paying your own way. If you don't, I'll start selling your things to cover the costs." Her eyes widened in shock, but she didn't argue. She just nodded again, her spirit completely broken. "And the third rule," I said, leaning in close, "is that you're going to stay out of my way. We're done as a couple, Lisa. We're just two people living under the same roof until this divorce goes through. Don't talk to me, don't try to fix things, don't even look at me unless it's absolutely necessary." Her bottom lip trembled, but she didn't say anything. She knew there was no point in arguing. I had all the power now, and she was at my mercy. With that, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her to wallow in the mess she had made. I didn't look back, didn't give her the satisfaction of seeing me second-guess my decision. I had made up my mind, and I wasn't going to let her guilt me into changing it. That night, I slept in one of the guest rooms, the bed cold and unfamiliar, but it didn't matter. I wasn't interested in comfort anymore. I was interested in making sure Lisa felt every ounce of the pain she had caused me. The next morning, she was gone when I came downstairs. I didn't bother to ask where she went or what she was doing. As long as she followed my rules, I didn't care. But when she returned a few hours later, I saw the resignation in her eyes, the way she avoided looking at me. She had gone out to look for a job, just as I had ordered, and the realization that she had to follow my commands only deepened her humiliation. The days turned into weeks, and the power dynamic between us shifted entirely. I controlled the finances, I controlled the decisions, and Lisa became a shadow of the woman she used to be. She stopped crying, stopped trying to apologize, and started to accept her new reality. I could see it in the way she moved around the house, careful not to disturb me, careful not to step out of line. But the satisfaction I felt from her submission didn't last. As the days dragged on, I realized that no amount of control, no amount of punishment could ever make up for the betrayal I felt. The revenge I had craved had become a hollow victory, and the emptiness inside me only grew. One night, as I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, I finally admitted to myself that I couldn't live like this anymore. The anger, the bitterness, the constant need to punish her, it was eating away at me, turning me into someone I didn't recognize. And the worst part was, it wasn't making me feel any better. But I wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. Not until I had dealt with the other man, the one who had dared to take what was mine. He had gotten away too easily that day, slinking out of my house like the coward he was. But I wasn't going to let him walk away without consequences. I didn't know how I was going to do it yet, but one thing was certain, he was going to pay for what he had done. And when I was done with him, he'd wish he had never laid eyes on my wife. I spent the next few days obsessing over the man who had wrecked my marriage. I couldn't get his face out of my mind, the way he looked at me, the fear in his eyes when he realized he was caught. The memory of beating him to a pulp wasn't enough. I needed more. I needed to make him pay in a way that he'd never forget. I didn't know much about him, but I knew where he worked. Lisa had mentioned him in passing a few times before everything fell apart. His name was Ryan, and he worked at a marketing firm downtown. He was a few years younger than me, single, and as far as I could tell, a cocky bastard who thought he could take whatever he wanted, including my wife. The idea of confronting him at his workplace crossed my mind, but I knew that wouldn't accomplish anything. It would only get me arrested, and he'd walk away looking like the victim. No, I needed to be smarter than that. I needed to hit him where it hurt, just like he had done to me. I spent hours researching him online, digging through social media, public records, anything I could find. It didn't take long to discover that Ryan was a rising star at his company. He had a reputation for being a smooth talker, someone who could charm his way through any situation. It made me sick to think about how he must have used those same skills to worm his way into my wife's life. But it wasn't just his professional life that interested me. I wanted to know everything: where he lived, who his friends were, what he did in his free time. I needed to understand what made this guy tick, so I could figure out the best way to take him down. It took some time, but eventually, I had a full picture of his life. He lived alone in a nice apartment in a trendy part of town, drove a flashy car, and spent his weekends at bars and clubs, picking up women. The more I learned about him, the more I despised him. He was everything I hated: arrogant, self-centered, and completely unapologetic about the way he used people for his own pleasure. I decided to start with his job. From what I could gather, his career was the most important thing to him. He had worked his way up the corporate ladder quickly, and his bosses seemed to have high hopes for him. But everyone has skeletons in their closet, and I was determined to find his. One evening, after work, I parked outside his office building and waited. I knew he usually stayed late, and I was counting on catching him alone. My plan was simple: I was going to follow him, find out where he went after work, and see if there was anything I could use against him. It was risky, but I was too consumed by the need for revenge to care. Sure enough, around 8 p.m., I saw him leave the building. He was dressed in a sharp suit, carrying a briefcase, looking every bit the successful young executive. I waited until he got into his car and pulled out of the parking lot before I followed him at a safe distance. He drove across town to a bar I recognized as one of the trendier spots, the kind of place where people like him went to show off. I parked a few blocks away and watched as he walked inside, a smug grin on his face. I could imagine him sliding up to the bar, ordering a drink, and scanning the room for his next conquest. I waited a few minutes before following him inside. The bar was dimly lit, with loud music and a crowd that looked like they belonged in a magazine. I felt out of place, but I pushed the discomfort aside. I wasn't there to enjoy myself, I was there to gather information. I spotted him almost immediately, sitting at the bar with a drink in hand, chatting up a woman who was hanging on his every word. She was younger, blonde, and dressed to impress, exactly the type I'd seen him with in photos on his social media. The sight of him so casually moving on from the disaster he'd caused in my life filled me with a fresh wave of rage. How could he just go about his life as if nothing had happened? I kept my distance, blending into the crowd as best I could, but I stayed close enough to overhear their conversation. It was exactly what I expected: him bragging about his job, his lifestyle, dropping hints about his wealth. The woman was eating it up, laughing at his jokes, touching his arm, clearly falling for his bullshit. But then, as the conversation went on, I heard something that piqued my interest. He started talking about a client he was working with, someone high profile, and how he was planning to seal a big deal that would put him on the map. He mentioned details that were clearly confidential, things that should never be discussed in a public setting, especially not with a stranger. I pulled out my phone and discreetly recorded the conversation, making sure to capture every word. If his bosses found out he was blabbing about sensitive information like this, it could ruin him. And that's exactly what I planned to do. Over the next few days, I carefully edited the recording, making sure it was clear and concise. Then, I sent it anonymously to his company's HR department, along with a note claiming to be a concerned citizen who overheard the conversation and thought they should know. I didn't need to embellish anything, the recording spoke for itself. I waited, impatiently checking the news, company updates, anything that would give me a sign that my plan had worked. And then, a week later, I got my answer. Ryan was fired. The news spread quickly through the industry. Apparently, the client he had been bragging about was furious when they found out their information had been leaked. His company had no choice but to let him go, and just like that, his career was in ruins. The satisfaction I felt when I heard the news was like a shot of adrenaline. I had finally hit him where it hurt, and it felt damn good. But I wasn't done yet. Ruining his career was one thing, but I wanted to make sure he felt the same kind of pain I had felt. I needed to go further, to make sure he lost everything, just like I had. I started digging deeper into his personal life. It didn't take long to find out that he had a side business, a small startup he had been working on in his spare time, something he was passionate about and hoping to grow. It was a tech-related venture, and from what I could tell, he had poured a lot of his savings into it. I decided to sabotage it. I created fake negative reviews online, posing as disgruntled customers. I spread rumors on social media, claiming the company was a scam. I even hacked into his website, causing it to crash repeatedly. It was dirty, underhanded work, but I didn't care. He had taken everything from me, and I was going to make sure he felt the same kind of loss. It didn't take long for his business to suffer. His reputation was already tarnished from losing his job, and the negative attention I stirred up was enough to scare off potential investors. I watched with satisfaction as his startup crumbled, his dreams turning to dust before his eyes. But even as I destroyed everything he had worked for, I still didn't feel the closure I had hoped for. The anger that had driven me was starting to fade, replaced by a gnawing emptiness. The revenge I had craved for so long wasn't as sweet as I had imagined. It was just hollow. One night, after another bout of sabotaging his business, I sat alone in the guest room, staring at the computer screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I had become obsessed, consumed by the need to make him pay, but for what? No matter what I did to him, it wouldn't change what had happened. It wouldn't take away the betrayal or the pain. I realized then that I was losing myself in this quest for revenge. I had already taken everything from him, his job, his business, his future. But it didn't make me feel any better. If anything, it made me feel worse, like I had sunk to his level, becoming the very thing I despised. I closed the laptop and leaned back in the chair, rubbing my hands over my face. What was I doing? Where was this all leading? I had no answers, only the sickening realization that no amount of revenge could heal the wound that had been inflicted on me. And then, in that moment of clarity, I made a decision. It was time to end this. It was time to walk away from the wreckage I had created and figure out how to rebuild my life from the ground up. But first, I had one final act of revenge left in me. I wasn't going to let him get off completely. I needed to confront him one last time, to make sure he knew exactly who was responsible for everything that had happened to him. The next day, I drove to his apartment. I knew he'd be home, he had nowhere else to go. The building was in a nicer part of town, the kind of place that made it clear he had been living well before I destroyed his life. I walked up to his door and knocked, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I thought about turning back, about leaving him to the ruins of his life. But I needed to see this through. I needed to see the look on his face when he realized who had been behind his downfall. The door opened, and there he was. Ryan. He looked different, thinner, tired, his face etched with the stress of the past few weeks. When he saw me, his eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, we just stared at each other in silence. "John," he finally said, his voice laced with disbelief. What are you doing here?" I didn't answer right away. I just stood there, taking in the sight of him, the man who had taken everything from me, now reduced to a shell of his former self. "I came to see how you're doing," I finally said, my voice cold. He blinked, clearly taken aback by my tone. "I'm not great," he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. Things have been rough. I let out a humorless laugh. Rough? That's one way to put it. He looked at me warily, clearly sensing that something was off. Why are you really here, John? I took a step closer, lowering my voice to a menacing whisper. I'm here to let you know that everything that's happened to you, all the shit you've been going through, it's all because of me. His eyes widened in shock, and he took a step back, as if he could physically distance himself from my words. What are you talking about? I'm talking about your job, I continued, the anger bubbling up again. Your business. Your life. I'm the reason it's all falling apart. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to process what I was saying. But, why? Why would you do that? Why? I repeated, incredulous. Because you fucked my wife, you piece of shit. You thought you could just walk away after destroying my marriage? After ruining my life? He paled, the realization finally sinking in. John, I didn't mean for it to happen. I didn't know. Save it, I snapped, cutting him off. I don't want your excuses. I just wanted to see your face when you realized that you've lost everything. Just like I did. He looked down at the floor, his shoulders slumping in defeat. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him, seeing him like this, broken, defeated. But then I remembered the way he had looked at me that day in my house, the smugness in his eyes when he thought he could just get away with everything. I'm not going to kill you, I said, my voice low and cold. But I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember that every single thing that's happened to you is your own damn fault. You brought this on yourself. He nodded, still not looking at me, and I turned to leave. But as I reached the door, I paused, looking back at him one last time. Oh, and one more thing, I added, my voice dripping with disdain. Stay the fuck away from my wife. With that, I walked out of his apartment, leaving him standing there in the wreckage of his life. I didn't look back, didn't feel the need to. The revenge I had sought was complete, but it didn't bring the closure I had hoped for. Instead, as I walked back to my car, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, yes, but also an overwhelming sense of emptiness. I had spent so much time, so much energy destroying this man's life, and now that it was done, I was left with the question I had been avoiding for weeks. The days after my confrontation with Ryan were surreal. I had finally achieved the revenge I'd been consumed with for so long, but it hadn't brought the satisfaction I thought it would. Instead, it left me feeling hollow, like I had burned down my own life in the process of destroying his. There was nothing left but ashes, and the reality of that began to weigh on me heavily. Lisa and I had barely spoken since that night when I laid down the rules. She stayed out of my way, kept her head down, and tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But the tension in the house was unbearable. Every time we crossed paths, it was like walking on a minefield, both of us waiting for the inevitable explosion. I knew what had to happen next. There was no saving our marriage, not after everything that had happened, not after what I had done. The time had come to talk about divorce, to put an official end to the life we had built together. One evening, I found her in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner. She looked tired, her face drawn and pale, as if the weight of everything had taken a physical toll on her. She didn't notice me at first, too lost in her thoughts to hear me come in. We need to talk, I said, my voice breaking the silence. She jumped slightly, startled, and turned to face me. I saw the fear flash in her eyes, quickly followed by resignation. She knew this was coming, just as much as I did. Okay, she said quietly, setting down the dish she was holding. About what? About us, I replied, leaning against the counter. About what happens next. She swallowed hard, nodding. I figured we'd have this conversation eventually. I think it's time we talk about divorce, I said bluntly, wanting to get straight to the point. There's no point in dragging this out any longer. Lisa flinched, the word hitting her like a physical blow. For a moment, she looked like she might break down again, but she held herself together, taking a deep breath before speaking. I knew this was coming, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. But it's still hard to hear. It's hard to say, I admitted, surprising myself with the admission. But it's the truth. We both know there's no fixing this. Too much has happened. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. I know. I know I ruined everything, and I'm so sorry, John. I really am. I believe you, I said, and I meant it. But sorry isn't enough. It doesn't change what happened. And it doesn't change the fact that I can't stay married to you after what you did. She wiped at her tears, trying to compose herself. I understand. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just don't want this to get ugly. I want us to be civil, for the sake of the kids. Her mention of the kids hit me like a punch to the gut. Even though they were grown and out of the house, they were still our children, still the most important thing in the world to me. The thought of dragging them through a messy divorce was unbearable. I don't want it to get ugly either, I said, my voice softer now. I want to keep this as clean as possible, for their sake. But we need to be clear about what happens next. She nodded again, biting her lip as she gathered her thoughts. Okay. Let's talk about it. We'll need to divide everything, I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. The house, the money, the investments. I want to make sure we both come out of this with what we need. I agree, she said quickly. You've already taken control of the finances, so whatever you think is fair, I'll go along with. I don't want to fight over money. That's good, I replied, relieved that she wasn't going to contest that part. We'll both need lawyers, but I want to avoid court if we can. Let's settle this privately. I'll talk to a lawyer, she said, her voice shaky. But I don't want to drag this out. The sooner we can get it over with, the better. I nodded, appreciating her willingness to cooperate. But there was still one more issue we needed to address, one that had been weighing on my mind since the moment I decided to end our marriage. What about the kids? I asked, my voice betraying the emotion I was trying to keep in check. How are we going to handle that? Lisa's face crumpled, and I could see the pain in her eyes. I want them to stay with me, she said, her voice trembling. I know they're grown, but I still want them to have a place to come home to. A place that's familiar. The thought of losing my home, of not having my kids under my roof, even for visits, was almost too much to bear. But I also knew that Lisa was right. The kids had always been closer to her, and after everything that had happened, they would need the stability she could provide. They can stay with you, I said finally, my heart heavy with the words. But I still want to be part of their lives. I don't want them to think this is a choice between us. Of course, she said quickly, her eyes pleading. I don't want them to feel like they have to choose. They need both of us, especially now. They do, I agreed, my voice thick with emotion. We need to be there for them, even if we're not together. I promise I'll do everything I can to make sure they know that, she said, her voice breaking. I know I've hurt them too, and I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to them. I don't want them to hate you, I said, surprising myself with the words. I don't want them to carry the anger I feel. They need to know that we both love them, no matter what. Lisa nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Thank you, she whispered. That means more to me than you'll ever know. The room fell silent as we both absorbed the weight of what we had just agreed to. This was the end of our marriage, the end of everything we had built together. But it was also the beginning of something new, a chance to move on, to start over, even if it meant doing so separately. There's one more thing, I said, breaking the silence. I want you to stay in the house. For the kids. I'll find a place of my own. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with surprise. You don't have to do that, she said quickly. We can sell the house and split the money. You shouldn't have to leave. I want to, I said firmly. This house is full of memories, good and bad, but I don't want to live here anymore. You can keep it, and I'll find a place where I can start fresh. She hesitated, clearly torn, but eventually nodded. Okay, she said softly. If that's what you want. It is, I replied, though the words felt like they were ripping me apart. This house had been our home for so long, and leaving it behind felt like cutting ties with my entire past. But I knew it was the right thing to do, for both of us. We spent the next few hours going over the details: who would get what, how we would handle the legal aspects, and what we would tell the kids. It was a painful, exhausting conversation, but it was necessary. We both needed closure, and this was the only way to get it. By the time we finished, the sun had long since set, and the house was shrouded in darkness. I felt drained, emotionally and physically, but there was also a sense of relief. The decision had been made, and now all that was left was to follow through. "I guess that's it," I said, standing up and stretching my stiff muscles. "We'll talk to the lawyers and get the process started." "Yeah," Lisa replied, her voice small and defeated. "I'll make the call tomorrow." I nodded, unsure of what else to say. There were no words that could make this easier, no words that could fix the damage that had been done. All we could do was move forward, one painful step at a time. As I turned to leave the kitchen, Lisa called out to me, her voice trembling. "John?" I paused, looking back at her. "Yeah?" "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her eyes filled with regret. "For everything. I know I can't fix it, but I need you to know how sorry I am." I didn't respond right away. What was there to say? Her apology couldn't change what had happened, couldn't erase the pain or the betrayal. But I could see that she was genuinely remorseful, that she was hurting just as much as I was. "I know," I said finally, my voice softening. "I know you're sorry. And maybe one day, I'll be able to forgive you. But right now, I just need time." She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks once more. "Take all the time you need," she whispered. "I'll be here, waiting." I didn't respond, just gave her a small nod before turning and walking out of the kitchen. The conversation had taken everything out of me, and I needed to be alone, to process what had just happened. As I climbed the stairs to the guest room, the reality of the situation began to sink in. This was it. The end of my marriage, the end of the life I had known for so long. I had no idea what the future held, no idea how I was going to move forward from this. But I knew one thing for certain: I was finally ready to start the process of letting go. And as I lay down in the unfamiliar bed, staring up at the ceiling, I realized that maybe, just maybe, this was the first step toward healing. The following weeks were some of the hardest of my life. The reality of the divorce settled in like a thick fog, hanging over everything I did. Lisa and I avoided each other as much as possible, communicating only when necessary, mostly about logistics and the legal process. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now felt like a mausoleum, a place where our marriage had died and been buried. I found a small apartment not too far from where we lived. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom place with basic furnishings, but it was a start. It was my chance to build something new, something that was mine alone. I packed my things quietly over the course of a few days, careful not to disturb Lisa. She didn't ask where I was going, and I didn't offer the information. It was better that way, cleaner, simpler. The day I left was bittersweet. I took one last look around the house, remembering all the good times, the bad times, and everything in between. This was where I had raised my children, where I had loved my wife, and where I had been betrayed. Leaving it behind felt like closing a door on a part of my life that I would never revisit. Lisa was in the living room when I finally walked out. She looked up as I passed by, her eyes filled with sadness and regret. For a moment, I considered saying something, one last goodbye, one last attempt to make sense of everything that had happened. But I didn't. Instead, I just nodded at her and walked out the door, leaving behind the life I had known for over 2 decades. The first few nights in the apartment were rough. I was surrounded by unfamiliar walls, sleeping in a bed that wasn't mine, and the silence was deafening. I spent a lot of time staring at the ceiling, wondering how everything had gone so wrong, replaying the events of the past few months over and over in my mind. The anger, the pain, the sense of betrayal, they were all still there, gnawing at me, refusing to let go. But slowly, something began to shift. As the days turned into weeks, I started to settle into a routine. I got up early, went to work, came home, and tried to keep myself busy. I started going to the gym, something I hadn't done in years, trying to rebuild not just my life, but my body as well. I needed to feel strong again, in control of something, even if it was just my own physical well-being. The divorce proceedings were surprisingly smooth, given everything that had happened. Both Lisa and I had agreed to keep things civil, and our lawyers were able to negotiate a fair settlement without too much back and forth. The house went to her, along with the majority of our joint assets. I kept my share of the savings and investments, enough to start over without too much difficulty. But the hardest part of the process was telling the kids. They had always seen us as a united front, and the news of our divorce hit them hard. We decided to tell them together, sitting them down one weekend when they both happened to be in town. I remember the look on their faces when we broke the news, the shock, the sadness, the confusion. It was like reliving the moment of betrayal all over again, but this time, through their eyes. "What happened?" my daughter asked, her voice trembling. "Why are you doing this?" Lisa and I exchanged a glance, and for a moment, I wasn't sure how to respond. How do you explain something so complicated, so painful, to your own children? How do you tell them that the life they thought they knew was a lie? "We just grew apart," Lisa said finally, her voice soft. "We both made mistakes, and now we're trying to do what's best for everyone." "But you've always been together," my son said, his voice filled with disbelief. "I don't understand. Why can't you fix it?" It was the question I had been dreading, the one I had no good answer for. How could I explain that the bond between us had been irreparably broken, that there was no going back? How could I tell them that the woman they had always looked up to had betrayed me in the worst possible way? "We tried," I said quietly, struggling to keep my voice steady. "But sometimes, things happen that you can't fix. Sometimes, the best thing you can do is let go and move on." They both sat there, stunned, trying to process what we had told them. I could see the hurt in their eyes, the way they were trying to make sense of something that made no sense at all. And in that moment, I felt like I had failed them, failed as a father, failed as a husband, failed as a man. "What about us?" my daughter finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happens to us?" "You're still our kids," Lisa said quickly, reaching out to take her hand. "Nothing will change that. We both love you, and we'll always be here for you. This doesn't change how we feel about you." "But where will we go?" my son asked, his voice cracking. "Who will we stay with?" "You'll stay with your mother," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "The house will still be there for you, and you'll always have a place to come home to." "And what about you, Dad?" my daughter asked, her eyes filling with tears. "Where will you be?" "I'll be close by," I assured her, though the words felt hollow. "I'm not going anywhere. You'll always be able to see me, talk to me, whenever you want. This doesn't change that." They both nodded, but I could see the pain in their eyes, the way they were struggling to understand. It was a moment I had dreaded, a moment that tore at my heart more than anything else. I never imagined my life would unravel the way it did. My wife, Lisa, and I had been married for nearly 25 years. We had what most would consider a solid marriage, complete with the typical ups and downs, but nothing that ever made me question our bond. We raised 2 kids together, both of whom are now grown and living on their own. I'd always been the provider, working hard to ensure we lived comfortably, while Lisa managed the home and kids. We had a routine that worked, or so I thought. Our story began to shift about a year ago, but I was too blind to see it. Lisa had started to change in ways that were subtle at first, easy to overlook or dismiss. She was more distant, less interested in spending time together, and increasingly preoccupied with her phone. I noticed she was more critical of me, snapping over small things that never used to bother her. I chalked it up to midlife stress, maybe the empty nest syndrome kicking in now that the kids were out of the house. I'd always trusted Lisa implicitly. We'd been through so much together, financial struggles, raising kids, the loss of her father, and had come out stronger on the other side. That's why when she started taking more girls' nights out and spending time at the gym, I didn't think much of it. She told me she needed time for herself, to feel more confident and attractive again. I supported her in that, never once suspecting there could be anything more to it. Our sex life, which had once been the cornerstone of our connection, became sporadic and mechanical. She claimed she was too tired, too stressed, or just not in the mood. It stung, but I convinced myself that it was just another phase in a long marriage. I tried to be patient, to give her space, hoping things would eventually return to normal.
But they didn't. Instead, the distance between us only grew.
I started noticing little things that didn't add up. She began locking her phone, something she'd never done before. There were nights when she'd go out and wouldn't return until late, with vague excuses about getting caught up with friends. Her wardrobe